Stacey, thanks so much for joining me for that first chat we had.
Cool to be here.
It's real good to be here with you. I just wanted to talk around some questions for perhaps a pastor who's thinking about taking his church on a bicultural journey. And we'll just start with the question of why would you encourage and how would you encourage a pastor to be biculturally aware?
First of all, we probably wouldn't encourage a pastor to be a bicultural journey. It'd have to be something that God drops in his spirit. When that happens, then I believe anyway, they're going to have the perseverance to go on with that. If it's a good thought that we encouraged you with, it's a good thought, but it'll maybe burn out. But how can we encourage that? I think that we can encourage by being genuine within our talks about, the possibilities at the very ground zero, talk about where we are as a congregation, where we want to be, include Māori in that, and we have to have these conversations around, okay, our church culture has been this way. What would it look like transitioning into this, involving everyone, all groups, down from young people up to the old people, so that when the initial transfer or transition from the front happens, there's no shock, there's no rock that hasn't been unturned, no question, no hurt person that hasn't heard what we're talking about in our desire, and just really pushing kotahitanga first, eh? It's always got about, okay, we're not just doing this at the front, we're doing this, and we've come to an agreement maybe, and it's going to look a bit, like a ship docking in the port. It's going to be a bit like this to begin with, but sooner or later we're going to work into place, eh? So allowing and making people know that we're not going to get this right all the time, but we're going to have heaps of grace with each other. Before the whole Māori and Pākehā thing, to be honest with you, we're just going to have grace with each other and the unknown, eh? Because we're all uneasy when we don't know what's going on. So, yeah.
What do you think the key priorities are on that journey?
The key priorities is for me as Māori, I've always said that when you're dealing with Māori, you're just dealing with another person, but we are people. And so remember that you're working with people's hearts. And remember that some people, if they get burnt, they might just walk out, and they could be newcomers, old comers, walk away from the kingdom, everything they've believed in. So we've got to be mature, and we've got to be discerning of how we approach people in that space to begin with. We've got to be genuine from the front, from the leaders. We've got to be sure. We've got to be strong in what we're about to endeavour on, and make sure it's inclusive. Yeah.
What sort of things could you start with? Songs, scriptures?
Yeah, I think songs are a great one. Because songs are a lot slower in regards to language. You can draw words out, but there's something about the instruments that brings a soothing and a calming. Whereas if you're reading a text in Māori, people just go, I don't understand, because it's too formal. But the sweetness of worship, it's inviting. So it's an introduction to the Māori language to begin with. It's hearing the sweetness of the song, but the Māori words in there. So there's no real thought as to, I don't like this. It's just a natural, I'll gravitate to that. It's cool.
If you are thinking from a perspective as being a leader and the kinds of spaces you're holding, how would you encourage a pastor to hold space for this to naturally develop, while at the same time being aware of things like the politics of things or dealing with emotional baggage? What kind of key skills do you need in that space to hold space for this to nurture properly?
I think we can learn a lot from Parliament and the government in this present time, and we've got to be aware that we don't get caught up in that fight. And so allowing space for our leaders to grow in, but also making them aware that this is what the world says and sees, but in our church, when we've come on this bicultural journey, this is who we are and who we're moving forward to be even more increasingly, which is the love of God, reaching hands, manaakitanga, all that stuff. Because the world out there is moaning about everything that's going wrong, but we have solution. So that's the culture of love and solution within that Māori context in the church. That's real important, yeah.
What sort of things have you seen or heard from pastors that are the same problems that they might run into, and how do you think they could avoid running into those problems? So maybe you've been helping churches who've been on a bicultural journey and just having got it all with their leaders, and they've said, well, we've had this, we've had this, we've had this. Is there any learnings you've had from that space? What could they do differently?
Yeah, it's a hard one. The questions are still the same, or the problems are still the same. How do we deal with people who come in with baggage, and it's the Pākehā God, and they've come into church, and we're finding it hard to connect them to what God's doing in here. It all comes about once again how willing are we to sit in those spaces of brokenness and not want to fix it right there and then. It just takes time and working out and the Spirit of God to do that. And we're making space for the Spirit of God to do that, eh? Not just making way for ourselves, but in that process. I can't answer that, but I can certainly say, this is what we do, or what I've known to work best. Say, that's happening in your church. I'll give you an example. I was going through a time, Iraina and I, in a particular church in the North Island, and this Welsh man who was dyslexic, Pastor Mike Taylor, he's a good friend of ours now, he's gone back to the UK. I got in a mood, went downtown, and he followed me. He left his whole congregation with his cup of tea. He didn't even know who I am. He followed me downtown because he could see that I was angry. And he said to me, I don't know who you are, mate, but God loves you. And I just went, oh my gosh, that's not the language I want to hear. But years down the track, I appreciated that, because that was my turning point. I'm just going to run away from God and not come back. I came back like a dog with the tail between his legs, but for the very fact that he hung with me in that space. And that's what we're going to need to be doing, just like that pastor done to me. From my own experience, that's all I can talk from here.
Awesome. I think a key theme that I've heard from you, and I think it's one that's so necessary, is this idea of holding space and bringing grace and trying to help people, whichever part of the journey they're coming from on. Like if you're coming with emotional hurt, how do we hold space for you while you heal? If you're coming with fears and concerns and anxieties, how do we hold space while you process your feelings? And I think that's perhaps a misunderstood area, because sometimes people will say, why don't you deal with this? Why don't you address this situation? And not understanding the heart there of, I'm holding space. I'm not addressing these, because actually, if I do, it will destroy the work of the Spirit here.
So true.
Yeah.
I love the sense of that, because when we're holding space, we're not expected of ourselves to do something. We're just, we're holding space that God can do his thing. And as we go along, we discern. Sometimes we can step in and do particular things, but most of the time we step in too fast. We don't hold space. We take up space that we shouldn't have taken. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And we just hope that at least some of these reflections have been a blessing to you as you're on your journey in your church. And do reach out. There are lots of resources out there. I'm sure Stacey would love to have a talk with you, but also prayerfully consider and talk with the people in your own community who'd be really keen to see this develop in a Christ-centered and God-honoring way. God bless you.